Okay, I'm going to do a video of something that I think is something that's worthwhile to talk about and make an example in Christianity and in defense of Catholicism, or at the very least, the importance of apostolic tradition and succession and why that's so important. And I'll actually make the parallel using there's many examples you could use of the importance of lineage, but I will give the example in the martial arts community, and I'll specifically talk about Bruce Lee to a certain extent. But I'm just talking about the importance of lineage and why it's something to, at the very least, has to be respected and being mindful of. And we'll talk with other, denominations and different religions in a second. But, first, clearly, what is lineage, right? It's just a lineal descent from an ancestry, or pedigree. So before we even start this, I think we'd all, for the most part, because there's definitely some exceptions to this, where we would think that if we believe in, in this example, Christianity or the Christian faith, we would want to be, or at least follow as close as we can, the teachings of Jesus Christ as close as we could, right? For most, I would say, not most, but I would say majority of Protestants, they will say, well, it's Bible alone. It's all we have to do is just look to the Bible. And I mean, Catholics agree to an extent that the Bible is the divine written word of God. However, we put a big emphasis as well on Catholic apostolic succession and tradition being just as important in kind of showcasing, helping us learn essentially what was Christ's true teachings in the church. That's kind of the big difference there. I will kind of cue in here, though, that, lineage and making someone's interpretation, the Bible alone is very much up for interpretation, because even if you have just a blanket statement of it's Bible alone, we all know from different Bible churches, they'll have a statement right in the beginning just saying, well, this is kind of our core teachings, and they will vary subtly from person to person, even though it should be, when you read Sola Scriptura, it's supposed to be kind of apparent just from reading it that anybody can understand it, but that's another side tangent. But what I'm going to start with is this article of Jesse Romero, who's a popular Catholic speaker, discusses, when he'll bring this up at different conferences, when he does some apologetics, about a famous Ann Landers article. Ann Landers was a famous columnist, and I think this might have been in the 80s or 70s, maybe early 90s when she put this out there. But it was talking about faith facts may surprise some people. And this might surprise, this whole thing I'm talking about, it might be a surprise not just to Protestants who either don't pay attention to it, or cradle Protestants don't just totally ignore Catholicism, just think it's kind of weird or different, or they hear some negative kind of Catholic bashing. But this is true for even cradle Catholics who just don't look into their faith and are just practicing Catholics, and that's about it. They don't pay attention to it. And I think you'll all learn. I think we all can at least critically think about this stuff. That's all I'm asking. That's all I'm doing too. I'm looking at this. But what this article said was, do you have any idea where your religion was founded from? If you are not interested in the subject, skip ahead. So basically, she kind of outlines, and she was not Christian. I think she was Jewish. I think she was a non-practicing Jew, but she just goes through different religions and kind of who founded them. So she goes in the Jewish faith. Your religion was founded by Abraham about 4,000 years ago. If you were a Hindu, your religion was developed in India around 1500 BC. If you're a Buddhist, 500 BC. And this is kind of the meat of it. If you're a Roman Catholic, Jesus Christ began your religion in the year 33. This was found even in Encyclopedia Britannicas. This is found in many early documentations of the Catholic faith, Catholic tradition, or just the basis of the faith. That's what it says, right? That the Jesus Christ established a church with Peter as the first pope. Now, I know some people right away are going to be really offended right away as a Protestant, like, well, what are you talking about? I mean, he didn't find that. He found Christianity, and we are also Christians too. That's where we get into kind of some disagreements, but something to kind of think about. And I will play devil's advocate with this, because I think I can see where some people might get up in arms with this, and maybe fairly, to make the argument. But he goes on again just to say some other religions. Talks about Islam, then talks even about Eastern Orthodox, how your sect separated from Roman Catholicism around the year 1000. Lutheranism with Martin Luther, right, with this kind of timestamp. But then she goes into Presbyterian, Unitarian, Congregationalist, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, even Mormons with Joseph Smith, Christian Scientists, Jehovah's Witness, Pentecostals. So the point is, you see these later timestamps where at some point, there's some exceptions obviously, but let's just say with the Christian sects, that at some point someone came along and said, you know what, people are doing it wrong. This is our interpretation, and this is how we're going to choose to interpret Christianity. Again, that's nothing really wrong with that, but I'll get into this in a bit. And then you have, again, Jesse Romero points out these different chief branches of the American Protestant churches. Again, saying that essentially, right, it makes sense, they're protesting, right, the Catholic faith. And it shows kind of different areas where they all, branched out with different timestamps throughout history. And I think for me, at least, I know when I was questioning the Catholic Church and looking into things, a big part of it is, well, where are they getting these ideas from, right? It's not all these are as explicit in the Bible, not all as explicit as black and white. There's a lot of things that aren't really explicit. I would argue that even a lot of these churches many of them being kind of Bible-based, Bible alone type preachings, that they are, which the Catholic Church is, by the way. The Catholic Church believes that it's the divine word of God. We also just believe the importance of tradition, which is what I'm going to highlight here. They all are Bible believing, but yet they have a lot of key kind of differences in their interpretation. Okay, we could talk about all these things and go off and spin off on yarns, but where I'm going to make this kind of parallel is to the example. I'm using the example of Jeet Kune Do or martial arts. Jeet Kune Do. Let me say this, I'm just using martial arts in general. I was a huge martial arts buff and fan for a while. If you're into martial arts, you are into Lineage. Lineage is a huge part of martial arts, right? Because if you're going to study a martial art, you want to make sure that it's legit, that someone didn't just make this up and they're teaching you. They want to make sure they're well trained, that you're teaching some authentic art, hence the martial art part of it. I'll use the example with Kung Fu, specifically a form of Kung Fu called Wing Chun, right? And here's an example of, Ip Man did not start this. It's supposed to be an ancient form of Kung Fu dating back to the Shaolin Temple, supposedly, but even that's part of the big lineage of it. He then was the most famous Wing Chun practitioner, right? There's even a couple of movies based off of him, famous blockbuster movies. And he has various, teachers and people that he worked with, and those teachers have different people that they teach. His most famous protege, Ip Man, was that he taught Bruce Lee Wing Chun. And Bruce Lee, most of us know who Bruce Lee is. He is, the film star. He also, if you guys didn't know, most people know martial arts know this. He developed his own martial art called Jeet Kune Do, okay, which basically was like an evolving kind of mixed martial art type of martial art that really didn't have a set pattern, but he definitely was starting to outline some criteria with it. So it was meant to be an evolutionary martial art. Maybe this isn't the best example, but it has a lot of martial art kind of steeped in kind of mystery because not all of it was finished. It was something he kind of talked about towards like the later part of before he died. And I'm just showing you a graph. This isn't the best graph because he taught many other people. This isn't even definitely all-inclusive because I'm noticing some names that aren't on here. But the point is, this is somebody's school. I got this off this image, and they're showing how they, this guy, I guess is the person, they're going to teach you the lineage, right? So it's showing him, different students he taught under, who their different students taught, and then why they're going to teach you. Now, if I was, in the martial arts, just like it's very similar to, well, I'll do one more example before I keep going. He did make a book or I shouldn't say he made the book. And this is a kind of a similar parallel to the Bible here. There was this book that was made called the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. That was a kind of the collection when Bruce Lee died. They put it together. It had writings of this book he was planning to write. It basically wasn't finished. And this is an international bestseller for many, many years. Many editions have made of this. Every martial artist probably has this in their library somewhere. And this was something that was kind of the core tenets of what he was working on. It definitely wasn't all-inclusive, like I said. But people go to this book and they take some of the stuff out of here, like dogma. Some people take some of it and it inspires other things that they do based upon it. The point being, though, is that if you were going to learn a martial art, let's just say Jeet Kune Do, which I even dabbled in that for a while too. And I mean, I'm not hanging my hat on if it was authentic or not, but the point was, when I got into my class, I wanted to see, okay, what is this training coming from? They just using this term. And nowadays you probably could just get away with just using that. But if you're going to get, say, training in Jeet Kune Do, which they do, or any martial art really, right? And this actually goes to any martial art. You could use this example for a book. But if you're going to get training in Jeet Kune Do, you'd want to know the instructor is carrying on as close as you can to what Bruce Lee's teachings are. That would be an example of using tradition. You wouldn't want to get training from Jeet Kune Do from someone who just read this book or some of Bruce Lee's other writings and just said, well, this is my interpretation of Jeet Kune Do. That's what I'm calling it. And I would argue that's what is happening in a lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of Protestant denominations. I would even say Bible alone, because there's a lot of context that is not explicitly laid out there that we kind of go back to the early church. Because if I was looking to understand as much about what did Christ teach, Christ didn't make obviously he wrote and divinely inspired the Bible, but he wasn't preaching from the get-go. And you don't see this in the New Testament either. You don't see any of the disciples making a clear distinction of being sola scriptura, because they're not racing to write things down and talking about how they have to write things down. The point was there's a collection of thoughts or collection of ideas, the best we have. And it was the tradition that kind of upheld it. So if I was going to learn Jeet Kune Do, I'd like to go somewhere where, the next best thing would be, okay, who's a student who trained under Bruce Lee, or at the very least, somebody who was a student of Bruce Lee who taught somebody else, who then taught somebody else that I'll learn under. And that's how almost all martial arts are like that. They have a crazy lineage that goes back, decades. And there's a lot of oral tradition and forms that are based upon tradition that were never really written down, as anyone will tell you in the martial arts. They didn't write everything down. A lot of it was tradition. So are things going to get messed up along the way, right? Can we, even if we have this, down this tree, are things going to get tweaked and maybe not totally exact to what he said? No, but it's probably the best thing we have at that point. We have that line of tradition that's teaching something as true to the former that we want, especially with another martial art. We want something that's as authentic as possible. So with me, my thing is, we got to look at I go back, the early forms of the church. Looking at the history of the church, you see the importance of lineage. That is why it's so important. Apostolic succession. And that's why it's so important to have an organization such as the Catholic Church, or one unified body on earth that helps do these checks and balances. So if you do have some random person on the wild card, which is going to happen because we're human and we're flawed, someone could make some errors, which happened in the Catholic Church, that need to be corrected because of the community is organized underneath that. But when you start having an unorganized unit, that's where problems come out. And to go play devil's advocate again, people will say, well, if Christ really, a couple things. One, we'll look at the first pope being Peter. That's what Catholics hang their hat on. A Protestant might say, well, one of two things. They might say, well, Peter, he was never the first pope. And that's not what the Bible meant by that. There's no proof that he really was the first bishop, that he was actually acting as an authority leader. Other Protestants, other writings, you'll find people actually admit that it seems like he was the first pope, but he got it wrong. That's not what Christ meant when he said that. That wasn't really what was happening. Again, if you can take that argument, it's maybe, if you want to say it's kind of weak, but if you start going down the line here, we got the second, third, even fourth popes that are all mentioned in the New Testament. Very, very, you can't get much closer to scripture than that, than having leaders in the church that are establishing the foundational teachings that were literally mentioned in the Bible, right? It would be like this book, the Tao Jeet Kune Do, being something where Bruce Lee's mentioning some guy in the book, and you more likely probably would want to get taught by that guy he's mentioning in the book, right? That's the same thing with apostolic succession. When we look at these popes, we find different writings, and many do. Again, you can look these up. Just look their names up. You can go on tons of tangents with this, but this is going longer than I wanted to. But you can look up Saint Clement of Rome, and you'll find Protestant writings talking about the Bishop of Rome and Saint Clement. So the point is, you see this stuff mentioned, and then you go back to what their actual writings talked about, what teachings and foundational teachings that the Catholic Church still uses. Foundational things such as the transubstantiation in the Eucharist, the reverence of Mary, the respect of the Trinity, all these things that are foundational Catholic teachings that that's the ultimate argument. You go back to the early church, you find it very, very similar to the Catholic faith, extremely similar. And I think the more people go down that rabbit hole, the more they start to open up to Catholicism being, the best lineage that we have to Jesus Christ. I don't, if you were to say, again, you're a Presbyterian, you have to go back to, well, who started your church? Or who started, if you're a Mormon, who started your church? Was it Jesus? They might say, well, Jesus was the foundation, but Joseph Smith is the he was the one that kind of took it a step further. That's again that's like looking at one of these genealogies saying, well, Bruce Lee started it, but really we're going to go off of Richard Bustillo's Jeet Kune Do as his is the ultimate kind of gospel. What he started saying was really true, the only true thing, one man's perspective. Which, by the way, side note, I actually did learn Jeet Kune Do off of somebody else, so technically my lineage was through him. But that's the equivalent, and that's why the Catholic Church is great, because we have we have a whole unit of apostolic succession and an organization. That's what the Catholic Church needed. If there's like little Jeet Kune Do associations, but if they're not in unity with each other, but that's what happens. You have checks and balances of people saying, okay, this guy's legit, this person's not. That's where the Catholic Church, I think, really shines in some areas we can kind of look at as far as apostolic succession. So that's just some food for thought. I encourage you guys just to check it out and just consider these things when you guys are looking at it. If you guys have any questions, definitely let me know. And these are just some things I want you guys to kind of just consider, check out. Shoot me if you guys have any comments, questions. I'd love to hear them. Love to hear your responses to this. Please like the video down below. Please share it. This is a brand new channel, and I just want to keep it kind of going. So thanks, you guys.